Sorry about that. Right, our next speaker, a fellow countryman of mine, he knows an awful lot about spending years in prison. When he went into prison in 1977, it was a year into what was called the criminalisation process of political prisoners in Ireland. And to refuse the criminality tag, they had to endure 4 years on what was called the blanket protest before then going on hunger strike in 1980. The next speaker was one of seven prisoners who were on hunger strike. I think, could I welcome to the stage Mr. Tommy McKearney.
Thank you. Unlike so many of the other speakers, I can't claim the privilege of having met or known Julian Assange, but certainly his contribution is enormous and his defence is imperative. We cannot allow this man and what he stands for and what he has done to be brushed away and lost. We cannot allow the oppressor to gain the upper hand by stopping a whistleblower, an absolutely essential contributor to democracy and freedom.
Here, here.
What I would propose to do is highlight the actual threat to this country that is posed by what is planned for Julian Assange, that his persecutors, those that are holding him in prison, have a vested interest in ensuring that the truth is never known and what is happening is never exposed. Let me just point to a few basic principles of which no doubt you're well aware, which may even border on being pedantic. But a fundamental principle of any democracy is that we, the people, are sovereign. This means that we, the people, must give our approval to each and every important action by the state, whether it is declaring war, dealing with civil disturbances, or intercepting or interfering or intervening in a labour dispute. That is absolutely essential if we, the people, are to be sovereign. A fundamental principle of any democracy. However, how do we, the people, perform that action if we do not have full knowledge of what is happening and if we're not in a position to give informed consent? And when this right to know what the state, and particularly, threateningly, is the deep state, is doing, when that right is appropriated or taken by an unaccountable coterie of often the deep state, we have experienced and witnessed a fundamental abuse of democracy. Democracy has been set aside and replaced by a totalitarian dictatorship. And I don't use the words lightly. When the state does not, refuses to disclose what it is doing or what it has done, it is imperative, therefore, that this role is performed by the whistleblower. And to do so, it is our obligation to protect the whistleblower, because not only does that protect democracy, but in a very meaningful way, it protects us. We sometimes overlook, because rightly so we're pointing a finger at the United States imperialism. But let's not forget there's another older imperial power involved in this process. An Irish poet, Brendan Behan, once said, "In me the blood never dries." But the British, it's illegal or impossible to justify activity from its own citizens and from the rest of the world. And far too often these activities of advancing the ruling British class have had dire and even disastrous consequences for others. How well known, for example, is it that Britain sent troops, many troops, to Vietnam in 1946 to reinstate the French colonialists? Did so by committing their own troops and, believe it or not, by arming Japanese prisoners of war. And without being facetious, that certainly ended well for the next 30 years in Vietnam, with the dire consequences for the Vietnamese people. In 1953, MI6, in conspiracy with the CIA, overthrew a popular, democratically elected government in Tehran when they overthrew the government of Mohammad Mossadegh. Only 60 years later were we to know officially that MI6, on behalf of the British state, had done this foul deed. There is, too, a war that was waged by British Special Forces in Oman during the 1970s, when the British government secretly dispatched its elite, discreet SAS regiment to the Gulf in order to maintain the dictatorial and venomous regime of Sultan Said bin Timur. His son, Qaboos bin Said al-Said, has maintained an iron-handed dictatorship ever since taking power in 1970. For even less information about that, I would suggest you consult the BBC's website. I can give you the URL if you want it. By the way, and I'm sure it's no surprise, there's no mention of the SAS role in Oman during those years. But let's take this just a little closer to home. Let's talk about what can happen in this United Kingdom. Not that I am particularly enamoured with the idea that where I come from in Northern Ireland is part of the United Kingdom, but it's a fact of life. And just stop and think what can happen in this United Kingdom. Again, not that it pleased me greatly, but the late Margaret Thatcher told us that we were as British as Finchley. Not always apparent when you're in Belfast or Derry or where I come from in Tyrone, but still technically we are. At about the same time that the British government was intervening in Oman, the British state was sending one of its old colonial officers, John Percival Morton, to Belfast in 1973 with orders to do a report that would revamp the RUC's special branch. The pertinence of this is that there has long been a debate, particularly in Ireland, as to the role of the British state in Northern Ireland through those troubled years. The received wisdom in Britain is that the British Army was dispatched to do a heroic job keeping two warring tribes apart. Another narrative, and here we can think of what Vivienne Westwood said about defining the narrative. That was the defined narrative brought before the British audience. Other narrative that Republican Ireland would say was that Britain engaged in a filthy, dirty counterinsurgency campaign where it employed and deployed its own resources and used loyalist death squads to undermine the Republican insurrection. those are two contending interpretations. But the MI5 report carried out by Sean Percival Morton has and will remain secret for the next 50 years. And Britain's Freedom of Information watchdog, the Information Commissioner's Office, has ruled that the police do not have to release this report for another 50 years. Percival Morton, an interesting character in many ways, belonged to the Security Intelligence Advisor Department of the Colonial Office. Born in India, worked with the old Indian Colonial Service, but in spite of the years he spent in India, he wasn't particularly impressed by the people he knew there. In what was frankly a racist comment in his memoirs, he described Indians, he said, were a sort of immature, backward and needy people whom it was a British function to govern and administer. A man to send to Ireland, to anywhere wasn't to report. Let me just mention another couple of facts. That report, keep in mind, has been embargoed for 50 years. And just as a matter of interest, the Information Commission Office, which has as its mission statement the providing of information to the public, what the public are entitled to know. It's a joke. Let's move forward a few years. The Secretary of State for Northern Ireland made a statement in the House of Commons and an inquiry would be established in relation to the murder of a lawyer called Pat Finucane. And he promised that under new legislation there would be a public inquiry. It has been established almost without doubt the death of Pat Finucane, who was a lawyer, qualified lawyer, who had no connection with the fact that his brother was sentenced prisoner. But it's established beyond doubt that party to the execution, murder of Pat Finucane was a British agent working with the British Intelligence Services and in correspondence with the RUC Special Branch. It was also discovered that part of the RUC Special Branch, the report which Morton had delivered, which cannot be seen for at least 50 years, had recommended, among other things, that agents working with Loyalist death squads would not be arrested, charged or convicted, effectively as proxy death squads. But by October 2011 it was decided not to establish a public inquiry, but instead to have a report conducted by Sir Desmond de Silva. In fairness to him, he did a reasonable report, but it doesn't come close to being a public inquiry. Within the last days, you may probably be aware of what has happened with two journalists, Trevor Burney and Barry McCafferty, arrested in 2018 in relation to a documentary, No Stone Unturned, where it was alleged through the documentary and very convincing evidence produced that the RUC Special Branch had failed to arrest, prosecute or even intercept Loyalist death squads on their way to murder 8 people in a public house watching a football game. The High Court in Belfast vindicated the two journalists, but keep in mind what has been said earlier. Whenever two journalists are arrested, their entire documentation and database impounded. In spite of the journalistic profession is enormous. It is fine for a recognised journalist with a track record and a large company behind him or her. but for the multitude of journalists who are dependent on cooperating with the police for stories, who are dependent on the establishment for a bit of space, a freelancer depending for his or her livelihood on a story, that sends a chill factor. Do not interfere with the state. Do not carry out an investigation. Stay well clear. Cover football games, cover concerts, do what you like, but don't investigate the state. Another couple of points, and I just don't want to keep on going, but this is a recurring fact in Northern Ireland, that the state can hide, disguise, and refuse to acknowledge what it has done. A file on a young lad called Paul Withers, shot dead by the RUC in 1981, aged 15 years of age. He was throwing a stone through a window when he was shot dead by the RUC, that's the Royal Ulster Constabulary. That file until 2059. That's 40 years from now. Now, what reason would there be to hide, disguise that file for 40 years? Quite simply, it would be easy to redact the name of the constable or sergeant or whatever officer was there if that was what concerns them. But the actual details, why? Another case, a young girl called Julie Livingstone, shot by the British Army with a rubber plastic bullet. She was 14 years of age, coming home from a shop doing an errand for her mother. Inconceivable that she was anything other than a 14-year-old child. That file is closed until 2064. What on earth is the reason for that? Again, the name of the soldier could be redacted if that's what the concern is, that retribution might be visited on him or his family, and that's a reasonable request, but what about the rest of the details? There is a consistent record of denial within the British state for its activities. I have outlined some of their hidden wars abroad. I have outlined what can happen here in the United Kingdom. And just in the by and by, when I was doing a piece of research for this, I come across another strange fact. A file relating to the abdication of King Edward the 7th, or 8th maybe it is, I'm not too sure. The 8th, okay, thanks, I'm not an expert on the British monarchy. But this file, it's closed until the year 2037. Now, the argument might be that to release it might embarrass Her Majesty the Queen, an old uncle that she presumably didn't know, and we might argue on the other hand, or suggest on the other hand, that someone that has been married for 60 years to Philip Mountbatten would have a fairly high threshold of embarrassment. But it's much more likely, friends and comrades, that what's at stake there from the British state, from the deep state, is the vile relationship between Edward and other members of the British ruling class with Nazi Germany. And that's what the threat is. It's not to embarrass Queen Elizabeth. That is and continues to be a living file, an existing file from within this United Kingdom. We heard Larry talk eloquently of his experience of the legal system here. Just keep in mind that in Northern Ireland, for 40 years now, we've had no jury trials under a system set up by an officer of British intelligence, Lord Diblock. You don't see a jury. There is also what was known as inverted rules of evidence. So contrary to the normal practice where the prosecution has to prove that a statement was made validly and voluntarily, all the police have to do is write it out and say, yes, how do you prove you didn't make a statement voluntarily? That's an incredibly dangerous situation, supported by the lack of ability to make accountable the state. Now, let's then talk about what I started to say at the start, the threat this poses to a democratic society. The question is, who governs? Is it we the people, or is it some deep state? Are we consulted about making war? Are we allowed to make give informed consent? I outlined a number of cases. There's a more recent one. How well informed was the consent to attack Iraq? How much consent informed was there to bomb Libya, enter Afghanistan? These are all recent cases. There's also the case, friends, that this agency that is beyond investigation interfered here in Britain. I'm distinguishing between Northern Ireland and Britain in a labour dispute. British intelligence had its dark hand on the efforts of the National Union of Mine Workers to save their communities. Keep that in mind. So when we have this, let's keep in mind the threat. I'm not sure if any of you read today's Morning Star, but the front page has a very interesting article about Mike Pompeo, US Secretary of State, who's effectively threatening the election of Jeremy Corbyn. Hard to believe that the sovereignty of this state could be so rudely set aside by the US Secretary of State. But then keep in mind also that Esther McVeigh of the Conservative and Tory Party suggested proroguing Parliament, presumably unaware of the consequences for Charles I when he attempted the same thing, but let's say no more. Also, keep in mind that after Corbyn was elected to the leadership of the Labour Party, that a general in the British Army gave an interview to the London Times saying that it might even lead the army to mutiny. And if anybody was in any doubt, we saw those vile photographs of British soldiers using Corbyn's photograph for target practice. That is psychological conditioning. Yeah. Also, the ex-head of MI6 has mentioned the fact that Corbyn he doesn't think is suitable. Don't forget that there is very credible evidence that in the early 70s, senior members of the British ruling class were considering the potential of staging a coup. Now, you may think or say or believe that what I'm talking about here is exaggeration. It's possibly bordering on the conspiratorial. But when I look at what has happened in the part of the world that I come from, where we can't find out for 50 years the recommendations of John Morton and many others, we can't find out why Julie Livingstone at 14 years of age was shot dead, why Paul Withers at 15 was shot dead. We can't ignore the fact the investigation into the Loughlin Island shootings, that's no stone turned. But that creates precedent. What you have, whether I am making sense or not, what you must have is the right to know. You have to know, because only by knowing can you take the decisions that will protect not just civil liberties, not just democracy, but your very existence. Because there comes the day when you're told that a trade union is illegal, that you have no right to a home, that you have no right to residence. Those are the rights that you can lose when the dark hand of the deep state takes over. But you have a right to know, and you'll only know when you demand that right, and we'll only have that right when, in the absence of the state giving us the information, and let's face it, that's not going to happen, we have to have heroic, decent people like Snowden, Chelsea Manning and Julian Assange to deliver the necessity. We must, as a vital necessity, as an absolute imperative, to protect not just the freedom and life of a decent man, but the freedom of each and every one of us, we must see the imperative of protecting Julian Assange and to ensure that he is not extradited to the United States to spend the rest of his life in ignominious imprisonment. So thanks.